Hello, welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society Earth Day Lecture. My name is Aaron Kerr. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Gannon University, where I teach ethics, environmental ethics, healthcare ethics. So earth care and healthcare are on my mind a lot, and not more so perhaps than right now when we're dealing globally with the pandemic. I'd like to thank Angela Beaumont for her work at the Jefferson and getting me connected to this lecture, and I'd like to thank also Colleen Doherty, who now works at the Jefferson, who was a student of mine at Gannon University. I'd also like to shout out to all my students right now who are struggling but persevering in remote education, especially the 60 students who are taking ethics right now. You couldn't have a more informative time to explore the meaning of human existence and ethics. So especially there's a student named Justin Groshek who's given me some insight and articles in the most relevant way in the past 2 weeks. In addition, Emily Montine, the campus minister at Gannon, has been helping me facilitate this ethics class of 60 students. So thank you to all of you. I'm, as many of you are, sort of shocked by the happenings over the past month and a half, 2 months. And I want to share my concern with all those who are suffering with the disease and those who are caring for them, and the families who have lost loved ones in this time of environmental and ecological and disease crisis. So, the Jefferson joins a 50-year tradition today of Earth Day, reflection on the state of the earth and a celebration of environmental conservation. The first Earth Day was April 22nd, 1970. And so we're continuing that tradition. I want to do just 4 things. I want to discuss today the environmental context of infectious disease. And then I would like to discuss 3 ways that we can develop a disposition in the midst of social distancing and moving back into an open economy, if we're going to do that. So first, we need to take a broad global look, and then we're going to take a particular personal look and the search for wisdom as we move into the next couple of months. So first, we have to acknowledge that the total number of disease outbreaks since the 1980s has tripled. So this means that certain global conditions have enhanced the possibility of something like COVID-19. This is due to many factors. And I've been reading a lot from critical geographers, social scientists who think about place and health. And I want to share some of the things that they think are creating the conditions for infectious disease. So we're looking at the environmental impact of global capitalism. There's a pattern that they see which involves extended urbanization, particularly in Africa and China. And so these rates of development create a very frenetic paced economic infrastructure being put in place without the necessary public infrastructures which would accompany these economic developments. So what happens is that you have a lot of people on the edges of cities doing a lot of work, but they don't have the public infrastructures that would facilitate public health, like water and sewage and so forth. Another factor is that on the edges of these urban environments are transportation hubs. So you have a lot of people going in and out and through. And sometimes there is a tremendous amount of travel. And if there's so much trade and travel, that viruses have an opportunity to spread in those regions. So there's a quote that's relevant here, which says, "Viruses have no locomotion, yet many have traveled around the world." So the final factor is the tremendous amount of global travel that is involved in our economic life. And consider Wuhan, the Chinese city where COVID-19 is said to have begun. This is the largest car market in the world. It has also been called a global thoroughfare. So auto industry executives in Germany got the virus from Chinese auto executives. So the frenetic pace of global capitalism, what Pope Francis calls unfettered capitalism, that means capitalism that grows and grows without attending to the regulations or the public infrastructures or the healthy employment of its members. This creates the conditions and spread of infectious disease, now an earth-wide pandemic. So when all this stops, when we stop the global machine of economic development, we see something like what is on the slide behind me. Now, on the left-hand side is the city of Los Angeles, where there was satellite footage taken of carbon emissions. And that was, on the left-hand side, that was last year at this time. And on the right-hand side, you see the same picture taken by a satellite of carbon emissions, and you can see it's very much more pale. So we can see that when we consent to social distancing and shutting down the economy, we are also consenting to the environmental movement's call to conservation. Very interesting. So as we move into a time when we're going to open up the economy, we would do well to enter this time to consider how nature itself could be repaired and how human nature might be renewed. Because when we give our consent to social distancing, we give our consent to an interruption leading to solitude. We all become more introspective by necessity. Perhaps we become aware of the frivolous and meaningless in much of our daily activity. We consider and reconsider our values, our consumptive habits, our desires and expectations, our appreciation of nature and beauty. All these are put in a new light, the light of solitude. So here we have an opportunity to search for wisdom. And wisdom in the philosophical tradition is defined as very simply as knowing that you don't know, that we don't have all the answers, but we can create searching dispositions. And I want to share now three people from history who can give us some insight into living in this new crisis and give us perhaps some wisdom. I want to talk about this gentleman here. His name is Thomas Merton. He was a contemplative monastic who lived in Kentucky. And he's standing in the picture in front of his hermitage. And he, throughout his career as a monk, desired to get farther and farther away into deeper and deeper solitude from the community that he was a part. So monastics live in a community. They're under one roof. But Merton wanted to continuously separate himself and become a hermit. And why was this? Well, the answer to that question tells us about our current experience today. He wanted to get deeper into solitude. And the interesting thing is, the deeper he entered into that solitude, the more conscious he became and compassionate he became with what was going on in the world at his time. Now, Merton's influence is broad. He impacted the question of white privilege and racism. He's impacted the conversation about socialism, Marxism, and capitalism. He's impacted the discussion about poetry and literary criticism. He has influenced the environmental movement and ecological consciousness. He certainly influenced monastic reform and church reform. He has said something of the philosophy of technology and, of course, interreligious dialogue and pacifism. So, what we learn from Thomas Merton is that the deeper that he went inward, the more awareness he had of the outside world. The deeper he went into contemplative solitude, the deeper his sense of solidarity with the earth and its inhabitants. Now, when we consent to social distancing, are we not having the opportunity to get a deeper sense of solidarity with the world and with nature? When we give our consent, we are entering a sort of introspective moment, and it can be depressing. Granted, it can. I'm going to read from my book, actually a quote from Thomas Merton, which discusses the nature of this emptiness of social distancing. And I want to have you listen to Thomas Merton himself. This emptiness is for the sake of a fullness. The purpose of the solitary life is, if you like, contemplation, but not contemplation in the sense of an intellectual, esoteric enlightenment achieved by ascetic technique. The contemplation of the Christian solitary is the awareness of the divine mercy, transforming and elevating his own emptiness and turning it into the presence of perfect love, perfect fullness. So the first thing we learn in this time of COVID-19 and social distancing is that the deeper we go into solitude, the more conscious we become of others, the world, and nature. So awareness is an inevitable result of social distancing. Now, there's another person who can inform our experience today. A person who was locked down because he was caught in armed robbery. This is Malcolm X, perhaps the progenitor of the Black Lives Matter movement. He talks about his own sense of growth and development while he was in prison. So I'd like to talk about his awareness and what it led to, particularly his capacity and competence and intelligence in telling the truth. So we need, with Merton, a deeper awareness, but in this time of COVID-19 and environmental crisis, we need a capacity to tell the truth. We need a truth teller, and we need to tell the truth to each other. He says in his autobiography the following about his prison experience. I still marvel at how swiftly my previous life's thinking pattern slid away from me, like snow off of a roof. It is as though someone else I knew of had lived by hustling and crime. I would be startled to catch myself thinking in a remote way of my earlier self as another person. So he understood that his pattern of thinking prior to his lockdown was off, and he understood that he had a new opportunity to renew his identity and become who he indeed was, a truth teller. We know today that there are a disproportionate number of African Americans who have died from the COVID-19. And we need to be aware of that and the reasons for that, about structural injustice, racism, environmental racism, racism in the healthcare system, healthcare in general. So we need to take a cue from Malcolm X in this time and learn how to consistently, as he did, communicate the truth. In a time of pandemic and environmental crisis, there is no room for partisan politics, for deception. Not when human lives are at stake. Not when children eat food that makes them sick or live next to industries that infect the air with carcinogens, like the Coke plant here in Erie, which thankfully is no longer running. But that was an example of environmental racism, no doubt. Malcolm X was more loyal to the truth than the education system that discouraged his innate intelligence. He was more loyal to the truth than he was even to his mentor, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. His search for and communication of the truth is sorely needed today. How might we tell ourselves the truth, face the truth of the inequities and environmental racism in Erie and beyond? That's our question. And how might we, in this time of lockdown, COVID-19, begin to look and listen for the truth and tell each other the truth as we see it? I want to share one more quote from Malcolm X, and it's directed directly toward white people. And he wanted, in this speech, which was 5 days before he was assassinated at Cornhill Methodist Church in Rochester, New York, he invites white people to relax and try to listen and make up their mind about the truth. He says, one of the reasons that I feel it best to remain very informal when discussing this type of topic, when people are discussing things based on race, they have a tendency to be very narrow-minded and get emotional and all involved in their emotions, especially white people. I have found white people that usually are very intelligent until you get them to talking about the race problem. Then they get blind as a bat and want you to see what they know is the exact opposite of truth. So what I would rather try and do is be very informal, where we can relax and keep an open mind and try to form the pattern of the habit of seeing for ourselves, hearing for ourselves, thinking for ourselves, and then we can come to an intelligent judgment for ourselves. How great his advice seems in this time of a pandemic, when we hear so many different stories, and when we are able to sort and parse out the information that is necessary for us to move into opening up the economy, from the national conversation to the state conversation, to the county, the regional conversation, to conversations with our families, to listen for the truth, to hear for ourselves, think for ourselves, and make an intelligible judgment for ourselves. Malcolm X teaches us that we have to listen for the truth, and it's an urgent listening. And because of this crisis, this listening has taken on a new spark of interest and urgency. So we have an awareness from Thomas Merton that the more we are socially distanced from one another, the more we have a deep appreciation and love for humanity and nature. We have an awareness from Malcolm X that we need to tell each other the truth, search for the truth, and listen carefully for the truth. And now I'd like to move on to somebody who teaches us the third wise disposition of a crisis, and that is Eva Solitis. And she teaches us how to grieve. To grieve. Eva Solitis was a essayist, poet, a marine biologist. She just died in 2016. In her book, Into Great Silence, she shares her experience of coming to realize that her own cancer and the possible extinction of the transient orcas she was studying were related. Her breast cancer may have been caused by the pesticides and industrial chemicals in the southern tier of New York. The orcas were vanishing due primarily to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. In the grief process, we become angry, what is perhaps the tragic sense of life. But in terms of environmental degradation and cancer rates, that anger is due to the fact that all of us are implicated in the patterns of economic development that leads to ecological disaster. Eva Solitis witnessed firsthand the tragic consequences of the Valdez oil spill in 1989. She notes that the cleanup is just as violent and invasive as the sound of the car going by. No, I'm just kidding. The cleanup is just as violent and invasive as the spill itself. In her book, she shares her sense of this. Now, I'm going to read an excerpt from her writing. She's talking about the Exxon Valdez cleanup. When we walk the beaches, we can hear the community of invertebrates speaking, the creatures, trying to breathe under a black blanket of poison. Equally disturbing is the human occupation, the domination and scouring of this poison wilderness. The relentless activity has the feeling of war, dramatized by the presence of military personnel carriers and landing craft. Already, one grizzly bear has been shot in the sadly ironic defense of Exxon's beach crews as they try to remove oil before the wildlife gets slimed. Very important, she helps us to realize that fixing things is not necessarily healing. And sometimes when we spend so much time trying to fix everything, we don't allow the necessary healing to instantiate itself, to take place. So fixing is not healing. When Eva Solitis teaches us, what she teaches us is that in grieving for human health and the health of the earth, we can see that our way of life has caused harm. Just now, many of us are grieving our old life, the patterns of work, school, business, global trade, and so forth. When, with Thomas Merton, we become aware of our grief, when, with Malcolm X, we tell each other the truth of our grief, when, in our anger and dying, we connect with the earth, what we're doing is we're entering more fully the human drama, and we're becoming conscious of our impact on the world, small though it may be. So we've taken a broad look at the context of infectious disease, but then we have given ourselves an opportunity to see the challenge of the COVID-19 crisis is a challenge through which we have the opportunity to become much more aware of our future. A future which doesn't have to be tragic, but as we work together and as we understand truthfully the potentialities, we can also make the flexible changes necessary in order to come to a new order of value. And this is really what the environmental movement has been pushing for since even before 1970, to develop a new order of value and the great value of human life, the life of nature, and the interconnection between humans, nature, and the world, nature and culture. So, I invite you to celebrate today. Celebrate with foresight the future, because we understand that we have a new opportunity. All the best to you. Happy Earth Day.